when a liberal professor who brags about supposedly being one of the most intellectually gifted scientists in the country challenges Barron Trump to an IQ test he expects to humiliate him. But when the results come in, the entire class is left in stunned silence. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Professor James Caldwell's economic history class at one of America's elite universities was known for his scathing attacks on what he called right-wing privilege. On this autumn morning, he seemed particularly fired up, his navy turtleneck and tweed jacket matching his stern expression. As he prowled the front of the lecture hall, the correlation between economic privilege and the decay of academic standards, Caldwell announced, his sharp features twisted in a smirk, is nowhere more evident than in the admission of certain individuals whose family connections matter more than their intellectual capacity. His eyes fixed deliberately on his newest student, Barron Trump, sat in the third row, his blue suit as impeccable as his posture, calmly taking notes. Take, for instance. Caldwell continued, his voice rising theatrically. Those who support anti-intellectual ideologies, who cling to outdated beliefs about God, family, and patriotism, yet somehow end up in our nation's top universities. One might wonder how they pass the entrance exams at all. Several students glanced nervously between their professor and Barron, whose pen moved steadily across his notepad, his composed expression unchanged. The professor's jaw tightened. Each word dripped with more venom than the last. Yet the young man showed no sign of being affected. Caldwell's fingers drummed against the podium with growing intensity. In 15 years of teaching, he'd never failed to get a rise out of a student he targeted. But something about this one's quiet confidence was beginning to crack. His professor Caldwell walked slowly between the rows of desks, continuing his lecture with calculated precision. You know, I've developed quite a knack over the years for identifying true intellectual potential. He paused meaningfully in its absence. Take critical thinking, for example, he said, now standing directly beside Barron's desk. It's fascinating how some students, particularly those from certain political backgrounds, seem to struggle with basic logical reasoning. A student near the front raised her hand. Professor, shouldn't we focus on the economic theories in the syllabus? Oh, but this is relevant, Caldwell replied, his voice carrying a sharp edge. How can we discuss economic theory when some of us still believe in trickle-down fairy tales? He turned back to Barron. Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you actually understand the complex economic principles we discuss here? Or do you just parrot what you've heard at Daddy's dinner table? The class fell silent. Barron looked up from his notes for the first time, meeting the professor's gaze directly. Understand them quite well. Professor, would you like to test that? Understanding something in Barron's calm confidence made Caldwell's expression flicker. Test? Oh, I can do better than that. He strode back to the front of the room. Let's talk about intelligence. Real measurable intelligence. Did you know that studies show a strong correlation between IQ and political beliefs has mild thinly. I myself scored in the top percentile of every intelligence test I've ever taken. The challenge in Barron's eyes was unmistakable now, though his voice remained perfectly controlled. That's quite impressive, Professor, though I've always wondered if someone needs to constantly remind others of their intelligence. How intelligent are they? Really? Caldwell's face flushed red. Is that so? He stalked back to his podium, gripping its edges. You know what I find fascinating? How someone who believes in fantasy stories about divine creation could possibly question my intellectual capabilities. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Barron remained still, his expression unchanged. Let me be clear, Caldwell continued, his voice rising. I can spot inferior intellect from a mile away, and right now I'm looking right at it. He jabbed a finger toward Barron. Your kind of thinking belongs in the Dark Ages, not in my classroom. Professor, Barron responded evenly. You seem very focused on proving your intelligence too, so I'm curious, what exactly are you trying to prove? The class collectively held its breath. Caldwell's knuckles whitened against the podium. Prove? Hespat. I'll tell you what. I'll prove that your presence here is an insult to academic excellence. He straightened up, a dangerous smile spreading across his face. In fact, why don't we settle this scientifically? Mina offers supervised IQ tests. I propose we all take one The entire class unless, of course, you're afraid of empirical evidence. Barron closed his notebook carefully. Actually, Professor, I think that's an excellent idea. His calm smile ever wavered. But let's make it interesting. If my score proves higher than yours, would you be willing to publicly retract your statements about conservative students being intellectually inferior? A wave of whispers swept through the classroom. One student